Welcome to Human Potential at Work, the show where we explore social impact, inclusion, and empowerment of everyone, including persons with disabilities. Get ready to be inspired, hear success stories, and learn tips and principles for bringing out the best in everyone. And now, here's your host and CEO of Rue Global Impact, Deborah Rue.
Hello, everyone. My name is Deborah Rue, and this is Human Potential at Work. Today, my guest is Paul Carter. He's a reporter and a senior producer at BBC. I'm such a big fan of BBC, and I'm such a big fan of Paul Carter, too. I was really blessed to interview him along with my co-host, Neil Milliken and Antonio Santos, on Access Chat, and I was so blown away by Paul. I'd known about his work, but that I said, please, Paul, please come on. So very honored to have Paul Carter joining me today. So, Paul, tell us a little bit more about who you are and a little bit more about BBC Click, too.
What an introduction. Blimey, I'm not quite sure I'll follow that. Yeah, my name is Paul. I work on Click, which is the BBC's kind of flagship technology programme. We broadcast in the UK on BBC News, and we broadcast around the world on a channel called BBC World. We reach around 80 million people a week, roughly. It's a slightly scary number. And in terms of kind of the things that we cover on the programme, I always say that we're not a gadget program. There's a fancy new phone out. We're a current affairs program about technology, and we're interested in that interface between how technology changes the world and how it affects people's lives, that kind of thing. So it's the whole gamut, everything from artificial intelligence and driverless cars to drones and everything in between, really.
Yeah, it's a fascinating program. So do you mind telling us a little bit about how you got involved with that program?
Fell into television almost by accident, really, and that's how I tell people it happened. And it's true. I was working in print for a number of years, and then just via a friend of a friend, I ended up working in television. And then I joined the BBC. I was lucky enough to join the BBC a number of years ago, and I've worked across a number of programs on radio and television. And then basically about 4 or 5 years ago, Click were making a special edition of the programme to tie in with the UN International Day of Persons with Disabilities. I always have to remember how to say that. And they were looking for content ideas for that show. So I pitched some things in, ended up making them, and I've been there ever since. They've never been able to get rid of me. So I'm quite fortunate in that we cover a lot of things relating to disability and accessibility on the programme, and we do a special edition of the programme every year around that subject, but we cover it all year round. It's not like we just do it in one episode of the year. It's not siloed away. So we try and look at all aspects of kind of access tech as well, and what kind of impact on the lives of disabled people that can have too.
And the thing that I love about the way you do it is it's not, let's go help these people with disabilities. It's more about, okay, and the good news is we're doing this, and this technology can do this. Oh, by the way, these things can actually help all of us. So it's very empowering and not siloed almost. So I just really appreciate that. But most people don't get that. Why are y'all getting it right?
Well, I think
it's a good job with it.
It's two things, really. I think one, it's just having those people in the room that know how to tell those stories. It's because I want to tell those stories in the correct way. And it's about putting the technology first, and it's about, right, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? How beneficial is this? But also it's having a really great editor who gets it and is willing and able to let me go and do my own thing and tell them and trust my instincts and know that I'm doing it right. And I turn a lot of things down that we get offered, and a lot of things that, you know, that sound good on paper, but then you just think they're totally impractical, or they're outrageously expensive, way out of the reach of most disabled people, etc. Or some things that you just don't really understand what problem this is trying to solve, because this is clearly coming from the minds of non-disabled people trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. So I think that's always the way that I approach things. And it's just because the fact that it's about disability and accessibility doesn't change the fact of whether it's a good story or not. Ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what comes first.
Oh, said. Paul, do you mind talking a little bit about your lived experiences with disabilities?
Yeah, sure. I was, you obviously can't see very well on this recording, but I was born without lower arms and legs, so I have no legs from above the knee and above the elbow on both sides. So I was born as a disabled person, so that's my lived experience has been all of my life. But I was very fortunate that my parents made the decision to send me to mainstream school when I was younger, so I didn't have a segregated education. And I've got two non-disabled older brothers, and so I was brought up treated no differently to my older brothers. So that's got a bit of a flip side to it, really, because it meant that I never really had to identify strangely as a disabled person until I was much older. It was only then that I embraced that kind of identity when I started to meet other disabled people and learn about kind of disability politics and culture and identity. Because growing up, I'd never seen myself as a disabled person because I'd never come across it. So I've been on a bit of a journey on a number of levels on that front, really.
And I hear that often on the guest that I interview, because I interviewed the psychologist, and she was born with muscular dystrophy. And she said, I don't know, I was just always included. I was always there, and I had a wonderful childhood. My friends actually thought it was very cool that I was that I had a wheelchair. It was convenient. So she said, and when she became an adult, society started really disabling her. And she said, if I only had to deal with muscular dystrophy, life would be grand, but I don't. I have to deal with all this ridiculousness. Oh, look at you working, Paul. Oh, wow, look at you. Oh my gosh, are you kidding me? I want your job. I want to be a producer and a reporter. And it's an amazing career, but you have this career because you're a talented individual. So I haven't told you this yet, Paula, but I'm going to tell you right now, but we actually have created a global nonprofit called Billion Strong. And it is an identity organization, because one thing that I continue to worry about is that people with disabilities we're not owning it. We're not owning it. I have invisible disabilities. I've struggled with ADHD, which causes major bouts sometimes, at least for me, with depression and anxiety. And I am classified as a person with disabilities under the CRPD and under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But often people would not think that. Now, my daughter was born with Down syndrome, and if you can see that my daughter has Down syndrome, but she often would say, I don't have a disability. Don't say I have a disability. She even did, one time she used the N word with me. Mom, I'm normal. And I was like, not the N word. Sorry, that's my N word. But I said, normal is overrated. You don't want to be normal. Don't be normal. You're getting older. Put some purple in your hair. I don't want to be normal. Let's not shoot for whatever that even means. But identity is a huge issue. And I know it's something that you explore, but could we really all come together, 1.3 billion people, and lived our best lives and explain that when you have a disability, it means you are human, but instead we don't do that. We decide that you have a disability, so somehow you're broken, Paul. And isn't it great that you're included? It's such a screwed up way of thinking about things. And so we actually are creating Billion Strong as a global nonprofit, pulling together. We have 57 countries involved now. Because you can't talk about identity from one country. You can't. It must be talked about overall. And I know you talk about this a lot. I first of all wanted to tell you about that because we're so excited about it. And I will not be the CEO of this nonprofit. I actually am bringing in Dr. Lamondre Pugh, who himself has lived experiences with disabilities, also muscular dystrophy. He has lived experiences as a man. He has lived experiences as an African American or a black man, and he has lived experiences of growing up in the southern part of the United States, the southeastern part, which I grew up in as well, which is a lot bit more prejudice for people that have darker color skin. It's just our realities of the slavery and blah, 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 all that different stuff. And so he has some really powerful lived experiences that makes him with all of his professional background, it makes him an ideal CEO for something like this. And representation matters, as does intersectionality. And so I know you talk about this stuff a lot, but I've seen it, and I know you talk about this, but even the attitudes about disabilities from your country, the UK, versus my country, the US, is fascinating. And I was wondering if you wouldn't want to explore that topic a little bit with us.
Yeah, sure. I lived in the US for a very short period. I lived in New York City for a while, so I've seen a little bit of it. I don't profess to be a huge expert on it, but I've seen enough that I definitely think that there are differences. I think, and they're not criticisms by any stretch. They are just differences. But I think a lot of what I've seen around disability in the US is geared much more towards charity and towards helping and fixing and philanthropy and all of that, which took me a little while to get used to. I'm not going to lie.
We don't want it.
But I think the big interesting thing for me is that the one area I can talk about that I do know a little bit about is my experiences of the media and the technology industries, particularly the media. I work in television, and I think the one thing that we're a long way from being perfect, but one thing that we're getting quite right in this country is our representation of disabled people on television and in the media, but particularly within news. What I still find quite surprising is that there aren't any that I can name off the top of my head mainstream news anchors or reporters on US television that have a visible disability, which I think is still pretty staggering, to be honest with you.
Really, it is. It's horrible. It's horrible. Once again, if we're not letting people with disabilities participate, how are we supposed to change the status quo?
And I think, and that's important, not just for tokenism or so we can point to the fact that, there's someone there doing it. It's because that very notion of representation actually breeds other people believing that that's a route for them, that's a successful career path. And look, just putting someone on television that has a disability isn't suddenly going to mean that 1,000 more disabled people appear in the television industry in 2 years' time. I'm not suggesting that, but it's a start, and it's one of the things that we can do to fix that problem. Yeah, there are huge numbers of other things we need to do around pipeline and recruitment and progression and all of that stuff that are the big things. But I think there is still a little bit of a fixation on US television about appearance, and I think that's largely where a lot of this stems from. That you still have to be the kind of white teeth, square jaw, the shirt and the tie, and you have to fit a norm, and I think that's still an area to get over. I would absolutely love to be able to come and work on US television and to be at the vanguard of that, but I don't see that changing anytime soon, unfortunately. I think it's not all doom and gloom. It's that things are absolutely getting better more generally. I think people are willing to learn and willing to engage, and that's always the first step. You don't get anywhere without buy-in from people, and I think we're absolutely getting that, but it's just about how we drive that on, and I think that's through disabled people getting more of a voice and telling their own stories, and you're seeing that much more often about people are taking the narrative themselves and finding their own platforms and their own outlets, whether that be on socials, on YouTube and TikTok or places like that. And there's a much more kind of guerrilla culture almost in getting out there and doing it, and I think that's probably the way forward.
I agree. And I will tell you, as an American citizen, I watch BBC News, BBC World, and I watch the news on BBC, and I do not go to the American channels. And the reason why is because I do not feel any of the American news outlets, any of them, are presenting fair, balanced information. I don't even think, I even wonder if it's possible anymore, but yet I feel that BBC does that. So I personally consume BBC, and it is discouraging to see. I know you're not hearing this as much. You were hearing women were getting fired because they gained 10 pounds, or Lord forbid you get pregnant and you're on the air. Actually, I see pregnant women every day, so I'm going to be cool with seeing a newscaster or a reporter being pregnant. I'm cool with that, but it all has to be rethought, and we're so far behind. And that's sad for me as an American, because as I was growing up, I used to think, only because we're told this, that we were getting so many things. But as I've become an adult and I have participated in this world, there's quite a bit of disenfranchising going on, not just for the population of people with disabilities, but for women and for other intersections as well. And we don't have to keep walking this path. We can look. I say this all the time. The U.S. needs to look at what's happening in the United Kingdom, because we're actually seeing, once again, it's not perfect, but we're seeing progress. I love how the UK government, and I don't know if you agree, Paul, but I look at how the UK government supports people with disabilities. And I don't even know how you call it, but you can go to the government and they will give you a rating of, I don't know how you say it, is that how disabled you are, or that sounds horrible saying it that way. I'm not going to say it that way. You tell me how it works, because
I think it does play into a little bit into exactly what we're talking about, in the sense that we do have something approaching a welfare state in this country, and people will have very, very polarized views on what that is and what it should be, and whether it's working or whether it's not working. I'm not going to get into that, but certainly, yeah, there is support, state support for disabled people, and to a degree it does vary depending on what your impairment is and how it impacts your day-to-day life. Look, that system is very far from being perfect, and it has a lot of problems, and I'm certainly not going to stand here and be a bell ringer for the disability welfare system in the UK, but when you look at it in a wider context, it exists and we have it, and a lot of places don't, and a lot of places that do have it don't have something quite to the level that we do. So yeah, but I think that does tie into kind of broader social and cultural issues, and I think that's a lot of going back to what I was talking about before, where I found a lot of attitudes in the US towards disability quite charitable, and I think a lot of it stems from those kinds of issues that we're talking about.
I agree, and it's the welfare part of it I disagree with. I think people should be helped, but I think people should be helped so they can help themselves, because we have terrible problems with this type of welfare stuff in the States, and not just for people with disabilities, but we have set up systems in the United States that we penalize people with disabilities from really going out and getting really good jobs and getting paid well. We penalize you. We'll take, you need caregivers around the clock and it's going to cost you another $200,000 a year. We just penalize people with disabilities. But the thing that I liked what the UK was doing with that was that it is expected that if you have a disability that you disclose it, and it could be a positive thing with the employer. Because one thing that I'm worried about, now, we have all this wonderful efforts being made right now to encourage corporations to include us in more meaningful ways. Include qualified people with disabilities in your workforce. Make sure that as customers we can use your products. It just makes sense. Think about it from a branding perspective, all those things. But here in the States, we make it so difficult that I worry about the supply and the demand, because we're creating a demand, but nobody wants to come out and self-identify if we can get away with not telling you. But there's no reasons, we haven't been given really powerful reasons for disclosing that we have disabilities. And now it's time, I believe, to come together and really be proud of who we are. I'm a woman over 60. Women survive over 60. You don't just put us out to pasture. I'm a woman with lived experience with disabilities. I'm a mother. I'm a mother that has a daughter that's 34 years old with Down syndrome. And sadly, I'm a wife whose husband has aged into dementia. They're calling it Alzheimer's now, due to a traumatic brain injury he had when he was 11. Unfortunately, when a car stumps on your brain when you're 11 years old, you might survive it, but you're going to have dementia later in life. So that's unfortunate, but it's just the way the world works. And so there's so many things that I think the UK and the US could learn from each other, but it's really hard for me to watch what happens in the United States right now for my fellow members. I just think it's really terrible. And I will tell you, Paul, when I first created my company, my last company, Tech Access, 90% of my team were technologists with disabilities that were so talented. I didn't want to be a nonprofit. I didn't want to be a charity. And so I was a for-profit, and we almost starved to death. And so then I created Rue Global Impact. We're a social enterprise. Oh my gosh, people want us always to work for free because we're supporting people with disabilities. And it's ridiculous. And so I think we've learned so much during this pandemic about what we've been saying all along. Please don't isolate us. Please don't not include us. Please, can things be accessible? We learned a lot when everybody rushed home to stay safe. And so I think we're trying to figure it out, but identity is really important, and voices like yours, Paul, are critical. So what do you think in the first place, how did you do your show during the pandemic when everybody's locked down? I would be curious of that. And
it's been a challenge, but what was quite interesting for us was that surprisingly, no one from management ever came to us and said, we want you to carry on, or we want you to do it this way. So we just basically thought, we'll do it how we're going to do it. We concocted a plan of how we were going to make the show remotely, and we just thought we'll just carry on until they hook us off the air, basically. And miraculously, they never did. We kept going. So we made the program entirely remotely for about 14 months. So we set up just before we all got locked down, we managed to set our two presenters, Spencer and Lara, up with a version of a home studio, if you like, so that they had cameras and lights in a room in their homes. And we filmed the links and the main parts of the show basically over Zoom, directed over Zoom, with on cameras, but directed over Zoom. And then any of our packages, any of our pieces in the show were largely put together through remote interviews on Zoom or Teams or Hangouts or whatever, and filled in with essentially what we call B-roll, with promo footage and other footage that we could cobble together. Wasn't ideal, but we made it work. There were a few instances where we managed to get teams in countries where lockdown wasn't quite as strict, where they were still able to go out and about. We would get crews remotely to go and film some bits for us there. But it was a challenge because we're a worldwide program, and in normal times we travel all over the world covering stories everywhere, and obviously we had to scale that back. We still did some stories, and in some senses we were still able to do that, but it did mean we had to narrow the focus a little bit. But one thing that I will say is that it actually made it a lot easier to get hold of people and to get people on the show that perhaps we wouldn't normally be able to, because everyone was just kicking their heels sitting at home, and so no one had the excuse that they were busy or that they were unavailable. In that sense, it worked out, but thankfully we're coming out the other side of it now. We had our first sort of entire episode a few weeks ago where every piece in the program had been made in person and out and about, which was just so nice, and I think it makes such a difference. But we just adapted, really, as with anything, right? None of us had a manual for this. None of us had a rule book on what we were going to do or how we were going to do it. We just learnt as we went along, and some of the early ones were quite ropey, but we tweaked around the edges, and we just made the best of it, really. And I'm immensely proud that we stayed on the air, frankly, but we did it, just.
And we appreciate the efforts because I get used to this content, and so it was hard when some of the content that I watched went away. So, Paul, what do you think? What do you hope that once the pandemic calms down and we're able to actually really move around a lot, are there parts of what you did, what y'all did during the pandemic that you would want to keep?
Oh, for sure. I think one of the sort of enlightening but also quite frustrating things about all of this is that a lot of the, what's the word I'm looking for? A lot of the kind of adaptations and adjustments, that's the word I'm looking for. A lot of the adjustments that we all made, or that we were forced to make, are things that we as disabled people have been asking for years, and we're always told, no, that's not possible, or no, it's not practical. And now all of a sudden, oh, look, it is perfectly possible and it is perfectly practical. So I think everyone's had an opinion on how work is going to look, and I think the reality is none of us actually really know, and we won't know for another 6 months or so. But I like to think that we will be able to keep the best parts of this, and by that, flexible working, much less reliance on kind of presenteeism and having to be in the room all of the time in person. I think that will be a big help. But I think also just maybe the fact that we can all be a little bit more aware of each other's needs, and remembering that for some people, video calling and the like has not been a great thing. If you're visually impaired or hearing impaired, for example, it's actually probably been more difficult. I think that kind of sense that we've all had to accept and think about our colleagues and our work life in ways that we never would have imagined before, considering childcare and schooling and all of those things that perhaps wouldn't have ever come up in normal conversation before, we're all aware of now. And I hope that's the thing that I hope continues. It's those conversations, rather than pointing to an individual thing and saying, I hope we have this, I hope we have that. I think, it's more that I think there's just a greater understanding that we all have individual needs, and perhaps we can be a little bit more flexible.
Paul, it reminds me of, and I know you would know about this, but a few years before the pandemic, there was somebody being interviewed. I'm almost sure it was on BBC. A gentleman was being interviewed, a very important topic, and his children came in the room.
Yeah.
First of all, the little baby toddlered in, and then the toddler, and then the mom rushes in to sneaking him out, and we were all hysterically laughing at this poor man.
Yeah.
And I won't even get into some of the stupid things people were saying, but anyway, we were laughing. Now we all join him. Because it's weird, Paul, is we actually have families that are living in our homes, and there's sometimes dogs and cats and babies and so
I've met
now
all
we're
of my
like,
colleagues'
oh.
children and pets and everything else over the past year.
Yeah, so it's like you said, we've gotten to know each other a little better, because I think a mistake we've made is saying, here's work and here's life. No, we got to have
100%.
work-life balance. And I believe it was yesterday or maybe the day before when we were recording this episode, the Associated Press had a tweet chat and they were talking about representation and people with disabilities. And they lost control of it a little bit, as you will with these topics. And they were talking about identity. Do we use people first language? Which is a little bit cumbersome, but some people certainly prefer it. And some people say, we all prefer that, but actually I know that it is okay to say disabled people in the UK. And that's something that I'm hoping the Billion Strong will address, because I don't think that corporations should decide what the community of people with disabilities should call themselves. I'm so trained. I always say people first language. And people are always correcting me if I don't. Like, I posted an article that somebody wrote in the UK, which was brilliant. And I had somebody scold me from India saying, Deborah, you didn't use people first language. And I'm like, I didn't write the article. See, there's a byline. It's not mine anyway, but it's a really valuable article. And I hope that you're not going to not read this article just because you don't like that they said disabled people instead of people with disabilities. So it's something we've got to decide. And then corporations get all clever and they're going to make it about diversibility or all these cute little names. I believe the community needs to decide what we're going to be called together. We all need to come together and own this. But I also applaud the AP from having these conversations, but what do you think the media needs to do overall to improve the representation of people with disabilities or disabled people? Because it's not happening in the States.
It's a very kind of multi-pronged thing, and some of these things are quite small things and quite quick things to fix, and some of them are big macro top level things that are gonna take culture change and time basically to get right. I think we spoke before about representation. I think that's a really easy win for a lot of these organisations. Put more disabled people in your newsrooms, in your development rooms, have people having those conversations and tell more authentic stories. And that comes from having those voices in the room, right? That really is the kind of the crux of it, that you won't ever get to that point of telling authentic stories unless if you've always got someone going out with a camera and a microphone who's never met a disabled person in their life trying to tell a story. You are always going to get a little bit of a them and us kind of scenario. So I think that is a big thing, and with that comes you've got to get your recruitment and you've got to get your pipelines in terms of you need to make it easy or easier for disabled people to apply for jobs in your organisations, and you've got to make them feel like they're wanted, for one, but also go where those people are. Don't just put the job ads up and think that build it and they will come. It doesn't work like that. I think it's about targeting it and working with other organisations and with people that know the field to help. That's an easy thing, but then that's not just the single solution, because that might help you meet your targets. That might help you say, great, yeah, we recruited our 5% of disabled people that we wanted to this year or whatever. But great, but if they're all in entry-level jobs with no progression and no career prospects, then that's not really helping either. So I think you need to fix that also, and need to make sure that there are career pathways, and there are so many ways you can do this. That there are schemes, mentoring, so many ways this can be done to help people rise up. But also, it's not just about getting people in and waiting 15 years for them to rise up through the ranks. It's also about bringing people in at senior level that have got the skills and the experience that can come in and help change your C-suites and your boardrooms and everything now. And those people are out there and they exist too. And it's about recognising that also. So look, they're big things. There's no one thing that someone can go tomorrow, oh yeah, I can fix this, and it'll be done by the end of the week. That's not how it works. But because of that, it takes an organisational change to make it happen, or it takes at least one person at the top to go, do you know what, we're gonna do this, and we're gonna do it better. And I have to say, a lot of the big tech companies are starting to do this, and they have disabled people in those positions. Jenny Leigh-Fleury at Microsoft, for example, and people like that are really banging the drum for this and doing really excellent work. So it is possible, and it is happening. I don't want to make it sound like there are no disabled people working in leadership or anything. Of course there are. But could there be more? Should there be more? Absolutely.
And also, there are many leaders working with disabilities, but they don't disclose they have a disability because we're seen as broken. And so I know that Dr. Caroline Casey was saying that, like, she had asked the CEOs of the Fortune 500 how many of them had disability. Quite a few do, because it's part of being human. It's part of being human, but they don't disclose. And so another thing we need to do is more of us need to feel comfortable and want to come out and talk about our lived experiences, so that if there are 1.3 billion people with disabilities in the world, so if more of us would really come out and talk about our lived experiences and what makes us human, I think we all would benefit from it. And I wanted to talk to you about technology, but maybe I can have you back on. But one thing I wanted to, if you in the audience have not watched BBC Click, highly recommend the show, and we'll make sure we put a link there. But another thing I love about BBC Click is that you don't just cover disability topics or technology for people with disabilities, and I love that. But do you mind just talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's one of the things that I'm really proud of. And, I tend to cover our accessibility stories because it's something that I know about, and we talk about lived experience and that. And I'm the kind of voice in the room that says, yes, that's good, or no, that's not. But no, I do absolutely everything else, completely irrespective of whether it's a disability story or not. In the past week, I've done a piece about drones that can be flown remotely over construction sites, wearable tech to detect blows to the head in sports like rugby and football. I've done a piece on robots making art inspired by Olympic sports. Over the years, I've done everything from I've been in an operating theatre during cancer surgery, I've been in a burning building, I've driven trains, of anything and everything. And that comes largely as well from having an excellent editor who never ever wants to pigeonhole me. And in fact, I'll never forget once where he came to me very earnestly and said that we were doing a story about a piece of assistive tech, and he was like, I was thinking of asking one of the other reporters to do it, and he was like, would you mind? And I was like, no, absolutely not, I'd be delighted. And that's great, and we need more people like Simon, my editor, in the business. But that's always been very important to me, that I'm not just wheeled out to do the accessibility stuff.
Which is what we do. That's what we do. So it's ridiculous. But Paul, thank you so much for your leadership and everything you're doing. I love your work. I am such a fan of your work, and it's very powerful. The show is amazing. And as you said, it's the flagship show. So BBC Click. But Paul, tell the audience how they could learn more about your work.
I'll do that again. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at Paul Carter TV, which is probably the best way to keep track of what I'm doing. I'm usually sharing pictures and things of all of the ridiculous stuff I'm up to, whatever I'm dressing up as this week. You can usually find me on there.
It sounds like an amazing job there. You have a wonderful job. So us mortals are sitting back going, oh, wow. How many people do you go into their living room? 80 million
It's around week? 80 million a week, yeah. I try not to tell interviewees that just before we're about to turn the camera on, because it tends to make them freeze up a little bit. But yeah.
I really appreciate your leadership. You're doing amazing things, and I wish you continued amazing success. And I highly recommend, if you have not watched BBC Click, to definitely make it one of your weekly shows, because it's really powerful. And it's a lot of topics, but it's all about technology and how it's making the world work, which I love all that stuff. I'm a big
we do broadcast on BBC World, but usually a week after broadcast, the show is uploaded to YouTube as well. So if you just search YouTube for BBC Click, you'll find it on there as well.
Cool. Thank you, Paul. And maybe you will come back on again, but thank you for the honor of being on the show. I love your work, and I think this is how we change the world. We just change it. So thank you, Paul.
Thank you so much for having me, Deborah. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, the Americans need to know more about you. All right, bye, everyone.
You've been listening to Human Potential at Work, brought to you by Rue Global Impact. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you consume your audio. To learn more about Rue Global Impact and the services we provide, visit rueglobal.com. To learn more about how you can become a sponsor of Human Potential at Work, email David at rueglobal.com. That's David at rueglobal.com. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll be back next time with a new episode.